This Kahoot, this is, let's call this our financing Kahoot. So this is 14, 15, and 21. I kind of lumped them all together. No math in Kahoot. I want us to enjoy Kahoot, so I'm not going to put math in there. So just kind of an idea of the terms is what we're looking at here. 14, 15, and 21. So let me get you guys a QR code. There's your QR code. Scan it, get you in. Or you go to the website or the app. You're doing that, you need a game pin. Game pin is 473-7706. Put our names in. Everybody in that wants to play, at least on your phone. If you don't want to play on your phone, you're welcome to play in your mind. All right. I think somebody's phone just went to sleep. All right. Let's Kahoot. Units 14, 15, and 21. Question number 1. A mortgage loan can have its lien priority lowered. Okay. Nine seconds. You can play in your mind. Mortgage loan will have its lien priority lowered through the use of what we're looking here for is a subordination agreement. Remember, subordination agreement, if you're subordinate, you're lowering your ranking. So if the borrower has 2 mortgages, they have a senior mortgage, which is their first one, and then all mortgages after that are their junior mortgages. So they have 2 mortgages, a senior mortgage and a junior mortgage. And if they want to refinance, the senior, that means they got to like redo the whole thing and re-record. And the senior mortgage is not going to be happy being paid after the junior mortgage. So the only way the senior mortgage will agree to do the refinance is if the junior mortgage subordinates. If the junior mortgage agrees to be paid after the senior. So subordination, you're lowering your lien priority. Questions on this one? Satisfaction of mortgage, that means you paid it off. Deed of release is another term for that. Isn't that what we get up and go to work for every day? Get that thing paid off. You've satisfied the mortgage. So let's see how we did on this first one. Barry came out first, followed by Tom. T, Michaela, and Cindy. This could get interesting. Let's see. Question number 2. The right a borrower has to regain the property ownership by paying the debt after a foreclosure. Oh. Eight seconds. Good job. You're redeeming yourself. You're saving yourself from foreclosure. So North Carolina, we have it's not the equity redemption, it's the, it just went away from me. North Carolina is a statutory redemption, which means the borrower can redeem themselves after the foreclosure sale. So once the foreclosure sale happens, the borrower has 10 days to match the highest bid. And if they can come up with that money, they can redeem themselves. They can save themselves from foreclosure. Questions on this one? Let's see what happened. Tom's on top now, followed by Barry, Michaela, T, and Mary Ellie. Question number 3. The main purpose of a mortgage. Six seconds. The main purpose is to provide a security for the loan. The mortgage is the collateral that the lender has. It's what they have to hold the borrower to their promise to pay them X amount every month for the next 30 years. It does create a lien. As a side effect, it does create a lien, but that's not its main purpose. Its main purpose is to offer security to the lender. Remember, the reason we record is so it's enforceable against third parties. So by recording, the lender's protecting their interest. They're putting that mortgage, providing that security. Questions on this one? Let's see, we got Tom and Barry stayed. Mary Ellie came up. T still on. Jasmine came up. Sean is our highest climber, up 3 places. Question number 4, Fannie Mae. Seconds. Fannie Mae is a player on the secondary mortgage market, and players in the secondary mortgage market purchase loans from the players in the primary mortgage market. So primary mortgage market is who originates the loans. Primary mortgage market is who you and I talk to when we want to borrow money. Once the loan is originated, then the primary mortgage will sell them to a player on the secondary mortgage market. Remember, Fannie Mae is the oldest, the biggest, the hungriest. Fannie Mae buys them all. Ginnie and Freddie are a little bit more particular, but Fannie will buy it. Makes no difference to her. Questions on this one? Not much. Tom and Barry staying. Mary Ellie and T. Sean's on the board now. Caitlin's our highest climber, up 3 places. What is the purpose of an FHA insured loan? Eight seconds. Purpose of the FHA loan? It insures the lender. It doesn't offer insurance. It doesn't originate. Good job, guys. It insures the lender in the event of the borrower's default. FHA and VA are government-backed loans, which means they offer a safety net for the lender to fall. You know, like the trapeze artists. Think of the lenders as the guys up on the things, and the lenders down there to catch them in case they fall. Questions on this one? So now we got shift a little bit, not much. Tom, Marielle, T's on fire. 5 right in a row, Barry and Sean. Question number 6, at settlement, commission generally appears as a. Seven seconds. Debit to the seller. We know where our commission comes from, doesn't it? Seller pays commission, so we're going to see that as a debit to the seller. Questions on this one? I'll just shuffling around. Tom, back up. Marielle, Barry, T, and Cindy. Looks like Marielle's on fire this round. Answer streak of 6. Last one. Which of the following items is not usually prorated between buyer and seller at settlement? Seconds. What don't we prorate? Recording fees. Each party is going to pay their respective recording fees. So for example, the buyer is going to be responsible for paying the recording fee for the deed and the deed of trust. The seller is going to be responsible for paying the recording fees of their satisfaction of mortgage to show that those mortgages were paid off, recording fee to show that satisfaction of mortgage, and then the lender records the new deed. So each party is going to pay their own recording fee. Anything else we're going to prorate. It's a shared amount between the parties. Questions on this one? This was a good financing Kahoot. I say good job, everybody. This was a good one. Let's see what our podiums look like. Third place, we got Barry. Second place, we got Marielle. And first place, we have, let's see, Tom. I got 4th and 5th runners up, Cindy and Jasmine. Tucked up there at the last minute. Again, you guys, please make sure you're going back through financing. I'm telling you, former test takers across the state tend to, shut that up, they could get some more points on financing section. I think we saw in your state exam, I think you can expect to see about 12 financing questions. 10 or 12, don't hold me to that, but just knowing the words, knowing the terms and the words. Remember, whenever you're in unit 14 and 15, put your lender's hat on. Best way to get through those units is to think like a lender. So as a lender, what do you care about? And what's about the only thing you care about? Your money. Questions? All right. Back to unit 17. So unit 17, let's put our appraiser's hat back on. And we talked about things like last night, such as value, how the appraiser can determine value, help the lender determine value for the purposes of originating a loan. And we talked about some differences already between the appraiser and the real estate agent, what they're doing versus what we're doing. So they get to put value on things, you and I don't. Only the licensed appraiser can say the word value. You and I will do CMAs and BPOs, and we get to look at the seller and buyer and say stuff like, I think your probable sales price is. Or to have anybody going in property management? Anybody heading that route? Maybe. As a property manager, you can help the owner that hires you, because doesn't the owner want to hire you, want to know what a good lease price is? So you can help the owner by doing a CMA and finding probable lease price. So then we went on and we were talking about the different steps that the appraiser can take to find the value. And the first step we talked about was the sales comparison approach. Sales comparison approach is the best approach when the appraiser is trying to put a value on resale single-family homes and land. So they're going to put the most weight on the sales comparison approach when it's a single-family home and land. The theory behind the sales comparison approach is that we can put value on the subject property by studying recently sold comps nearby. So we're going to go out, we're going to look at closed in the last 6 months, for example, in a similar area. Is it a quarter-mile radius? Is it a mile radius? It may depend on the market, density, population. But they're going to look for similar properties that recently sold nearby. And what that tells the appraiser is, I know that a buyer was willing to pay X amount for this house. So based on that, we can get an estimate of what we think a buyer will pay for our subject property. With the sales comparison approach, remember our little hand trick, left hand never moves. You got your right hand. If it's higher, you're going to deduct. If it's lower, you're going to add. Never, ever adjust the subject. Always adjust the comps to match the subject. The second approach we talked about that the appraiser can take to define value is the cost approach. And the cost approach is the best approach for special use properties. So think schools, churches, libraries, hospitals, new construction. New construction will fall under cost approach as well. What the cost approach does is it takes the land and it separates it from the structure. And the appraiser will put a value on the land as if it were vacant. Like if we were selling this as a vacant lot, what would it go for? And then they put a value on the structure. And they have to take things into consideration like depreciation, effective life, reproduction costs versus replacement costs. Once they have a value on the land and a value on the structure, then they can bring them back together and give an opinion of value for the entire property using the cost approach. The appraiser can almost always use the cost approach. So we want the appraiser to use as many of the approaches as they can, but the way that it's designed, they can almost always use the cost approach to help them get to a good number. So the third approach, the last approach that appraiser can take to find value is called the income capitalization approach. And this is where we are tonight on page 450. The income capitalization approach, the theory behind this is for income producing properties. And an income producing property is one that collects rent. So is this for a large apartment complex? Is this for an office, a retail office, or a shopping center? The income capitalization approach says that the value of the building can be determined based on how much rent it collects. How much income does it produce? So we're going to look at income producing properties. If you want to look If the appraiser's looking at a home and it doesn't collect rent, they won't be able to use this approach. They would just have to rely on sales comparison and the cost approach. It's based on the present worth to future income, which means how much money can you make off of this building? How much rent do you expect to collect? The income capitalization approach looks at something called the net operating income. This is going to help the appraiser and the investor determine the profitability of their income producing properties. How profitable, my net operating income tells me how profitable these income producing properties. And one thing that the investor particularly looks at is something called the capitalization rate. And the capitalization rate is the investor's rate of return. How fast, how soon can I make my money back? If I buy this large apartment complex, how fast can I make my money? That's their rate of return. How many months or years do I have to collect rent before I can see my rate of return? Capitalization rates tend to be subjective depending on the investor. If you are a brand new investor and you're just starting out and you only have one investment property, all your eggs are in that basket, right? And if that tenant doesn't pay that rent, how much are you going to make that month? Yeah, what's 0 times 0? So, but what if you continue on with your investment career and now you have 20 investment properties? If one tenant doesn't pay rent that month, you have 19 other properties, 19 other rents to fall back. So each investor's rate of return is going to be different depending on their situation and how many properties they have, how many rental properties they have. The math in this section for the net operating income, it's a twofold problem. It's one of those 2 steps problem. And the first step is define the net operating income. You guys take a picture of this or jot this down real quick, and then we're going to talk about what each of these mean. The formula to find the net operating income is just one that you have to know. Get this thing on a flashcard. It's not going to give you the formula on your tests. So if you don't know the formula, when you get to this problem, you won't know what to do with the numbers. So the first step, this is a 2-step problem, and the first step is to find the net operating income. First off, let me say this. Net operating income problems are always solved annually. So when the problem gives you monthly numbers, what are we going to do? Times it by 12. We got to pay attention to monthly annual numbers, always solved annually. So the first piece of the net operating income is the potential gross income, also known as the PGI. Let's call the PGI the dream. If you're collecting 100% rent 100% of the time, you never have a vacancy, you never have a delinquent tenant, every unit is occupied and all tenants pay on time every time. The PGI says, what's the max you can collect this year on this property? The PGI is the dream. Does that sound really realistic to you guys? Never any vacancies, never any tenants that you have to track down, right? So that's why it's the dream. The truth is when you're dealing with income producing properties, you deal with vacancy, you deal with collection losses. If you have to take a tenant to court, for example. So from your PGI, from the dream, you deduct vacancy and collection losses. And that gives you your EGI, which I call the reality. PGI is the max you can make. EGI is how much you're actually making. The problem will have to tell you, obviously, the information. And with like the vacancy and collection losses, for example, it might say your vacancy and collection losses are 10% of your PGI, or it may give you an amount, but it'll give you that number to find the EGI. From the EGI, then we deduct operating expenses. Operating expenses are those that the investor needs to conduct their business. So management fees, operation fees, janitorial fees. We're going to look at some examples of operating expenses in just a second. One thing I do want you guys to make note of, your debt service does not belong in operating expenses. Debt service, what's your debt service? Principal and interest. So your annual payment to the bank, taxes and insurance do count for operating expenses. Debt service does not. When we get to Unit 12, we're actually going to see this formula again, because we're going to talk a little bit more like an investor in Unit 12. And we're going to take this formula a step further and talk about where debt service works out then. But to find for the net operating income, do not include debt service, do not include depreciation. Again, we'll look at some examples of operating expenses in just a second. So you deduct operating expenses from your effective gross income. This whole problem is solved annual, all with annual numbers, and that gives you your net operating income. Once we know the net operating income, the second piece of this, we get to use the T-bar. So what the T-bar looks like is that net operating income is part of our value, with the number that goes on the bottom right is our capitalization rate. So net income is part of value. The problem will give you either the value or the capitalization rate. It's going to ask you for one or the other. It's going to ask you for the value or the capitalization rate. It's going to give you one and ask you for one. It's not going to give you the net operating income. It's going to give you the PGI, the vacancy, the operating expenses. So in order to solve this problem, we first need to find that net operating income. Sometimes to help you guys remember formulas, we can use like little memory tricks. And one memory trick with this one, y'all like Oreos? Man, that was really mean. If y'all don't have Oreos in your house, you're going to want to run right out and get some after class, aren't you? Sorry. I know, me too. One way that students like to remember is thinking about Oreos. And if we look at the first numbers or the first letters in the formula, this helps you with order. If you can remember, poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. That'll help you remember the order of this formula. Poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. I personally don't think Violet's doing too bad if she's eating Oreos every night. But poor Violet eats Oreos nightly, and that helps us remember the order of the formula. PGI minus vacancy gives us our EGI, minus operating expenses gives us our NOI. Once we solve for our NOI, we can find value or the capitalization. So let's look on page 452. Before I let you guys do a problem, I'm going to let you guys do a sample problem. But let's look on page 452. We have our sample income capitalization approach. So we start with our PGI, the max, 100% capacity. The max we can collect from rent on this property is $60,000 this year. We have income from other sources. So there's a vending machine on the property. There's something called a pay phone on the property. That adds to another $600. So the total PGI, the most we can make on this property this year is $60,600. This property has a 4% vacancy and collection loss. So we take 4% of the 66,600. We deduct that from our PGI, and that gives us our EGI, our effective gross income. So the PGI is the dream. In a perfect world, this is how much we're going to make this year. The reality is we're only going to bring in $58,176 because we have vacancies, because we have tenants run out in the middle of the night. Then we rattle off our operating expenses. So there's your taxes, insurance, maintenance, decorating. I think that one would be a stretch, but okay. Legal and accounting, advertising, management. Tally up all of your operating expenses. You deduct your operating expenses from your EGI to get your net operating income of $30,876. Net operating income, $30,876. The problem tells you that your capitalization rate is 10%. So you take your NOI divided by your capitalization rate. And based on this information, the value of this income producing property would be $308,760. And that's the theory behind the income capitalization approach. Somebody comes in, are we allowed a cheat sheet with formulas for the exam? No. You start with a blank piece of paper. You got to memorize these formulas, you guys. You start with a blank piece of paper. Now, as soon as the test begins, you're welcome to, spit all the information out on the paper. But you got all formulas go on a flashcard. You've got to know these formulas. Remember, these are solved annually. Do you have any questions before I let you guys do one? Everybody have both these formulas jotted down? The formula itself and the T-bar. Yeah.
So, Julie, do we multiply the 30,000 by 10%?
We're going to divide it. So we're going to
Okay.
say our net operating income divided by our capitalization rate. And that's going to equal value. Okay. All right. You guys tell me in a private chat, what is this investor's capitalization rate? you about another minute and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So what do we do first? Just read. Somebody in my day class said cry. No, don't cry, just read. So this problem says each unit of a fourplex rents for $650 per month. Vacancy losses average 10% per year. Operating expenses are $1,300 per month. If the property is valued at $150,000, what is the investor's expected capitalization rate? Because this is a two-step formula, or two-step problem, this is an example of one that I like to start with where I want to end. So the first thing I want to do is identify my X, because I got to do a whole lot of work to get here, don't I? So I want to identify my X, keep that focus on my X, and know that if the problem doesn't give me information to get to that X, then it's a distractor. So we're solving for the capitalization rate. The problem gives me the value. And the missing piece of the T-bar is the net operating income. Do I know that? Not yet. So now we got to go back and use our other formula. That's our PGI, EGI. So a fourplex is how many units? 4 units. They collect $650 per month. So each month, these 4 units are going to produce $2,600. These problems are solved annually. So we take our monthly rent times 12 to get 26. Is that right? 4 times 650 times 12. Okay. To get our annual PGI of $31,200. If I collect $650 every month from all 4 units, the most I can make is $31,200 on this fourplex. Everybody with me so far? This is what we mean by the dream. This is the max I can make on this building this year. From my PGI, I deduct my vacancy or my collection losses. So from this, we're going to deduct 10% for vacancy. I'll just do a little side calculation over here so we can see it. Do we take 31,200, and you can just either say times 10%, then deduct that, or you can just on your calculator say minus 10%. So 31,200 minus 10% gives us our EGI. Stick that down here. So when I deduct 10% from my PGI, I get an EGI of $28,080. In a perfect world, I would collect 31,200. In reality, I'm only collecting $28,080. PGI versus EGI. Questions so far?
Okay, so you don't divide the, I don't know why I thought you divided that. But
No, we're just going to deduct it. Yep, we're just going to deduct
Okay.
it. So it's PGI minus that vacancy, and that gives us EGI. Then we're told that we have $1,300 in operating expenses per month. Again, this problem is solved annually. So make sure you take all monthly figures and times them by 12. So that gives me an annual operating income. $15,600. My operating income. So I deduct that from my EGI. And I'm left with a net operating income of $12,480. Again, when we get to unit 12, we're going to see this formula again. What does it tell you about a formula that we see in two different units? It tells you got two possibilities to see it on your test, right? This is a great formula to memorize. So now that we have, and once we get the net operating income later, then we're going to take this a step further, but now we're just going to stop here. So now that we have that net operating income, this is my net operating income. So now that we know that, now I can fill in the rest of my T-bar. I'm going to finish this up over here on the left. The back fourth line on the T-bar means divide. So I take $12,480. I divide it by my value of 150,000. And I get a rate of 0.0832, or if it asks for a percent, it's going to be one or the other. They're going to either ask for a cap rate of 0.8323 or a percent, 8.23%. You're never going to see both in a test question. It's either going to be rate or percent. You convert rate to percent by moving your decimal over 2 places to the right. 0.0823 is the same as 8.23%. This is the capitalization rate, 8.23%. Is that number good or bad? Well, to answer that, that's a lot more complex than what we're dealing with in this class. Again, it takes a lot of factors into place. It's let's just call it a personal preference of the investor and the properties that they're dealing with. All we got to do is find it. 8.32. Did I get my numbers mixed up? Yeah. 8.32. Thank you. Here we go.
So I did mine a little differently. I had 150,000, or I had your monthly, the 2,600, and then I times the 10%, which was 260, and that gave me 2,340. Of course, that's the month, and then I got the 1,300 take away from that. So my total EGI was 1040, and then I times it by 12 to get
Perfect.
the 1240.
Did you get 8.32%?
Yeah.
Perfect. You could even found the monthly net operating income and then times that by 12, and you would have gotten the right number.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I did. So what I'm wondering though is if I don't, that original number, the 650, I just times it by 4, which would have been the month instead of the 31.2. But if they would have asked me the month, that probably would have messed up then. I mean, I would have known, but you said annually. So I figured I'd do the whole thing and then annually. Either way.
And that's absolutely another way to look at, another way to do it. Absolutely. So as long as we come up with annual numbers at the end, I do mine at the beginning. I work all annual numbers in the formula. If you want to work monthly and then times the final number by 12, you're still going to get the same number. So however, that's what I love so much about math, you guys. Our brains can see it differently. So however your brain sees it. Questions on this one? I got practice for you guys. Yep. Yep. To do these, you got to know the formula. You got to know that formula. Yep. So we'll show you where I got some practice for you guys in just a second. Before we put our appraiser's hat back on, the income capitalization approach kind of toggles between the appraisal's view and the investor's view. You know, the investor's for the purpose of making money, right? The appraiser is helping them determine the value. So they're both looking at the same thing. And we are going to talk a little bit more about the investor when we get to Unit 12. But before we put our appraiser's hat back on, another investor's tool, what if you're thinking about purchasing a property and you don't know what the expected rent is? You don't know how much rent it collects. So if the investor's thinking about an investment property, they may have to kind of guess some numbers. And one tool that can help them come to to determine if it's worth it is the gross rent multiplier, or what I call the GRM. And this looks at expected rental income. The investor is thinking about buying this apartment complex. They may not know for sure yet how much it produces, how much it collects, what its operating expenses are. So the GRM looks at expected rental income. And this is good for smaller units, 1 to 4 residential income producing properties. What the GRM tells the investor is, how long will it take me to get my money back? What's the one thing that the investor cares about? Same thing with the lender, isn't it? The lender is an investor. What do they care about? Their money. So before an investor starts buying investment property, they want to ask, how long is it going to take me to get my money back? And the GRM can help them determine that. The GRM only looks at 2 things. It looks at the sales price divided by rental income. Typically with the GRM, if it's a residential property, we may look at monthly rental income. And that'll tell the investor how many months until I get my money back. If it's a commercial property, they will look at annual rental income. And that's going to tell them how many years before I get my money back. So just the sales price as it relates to the rental income. Residential is monthly, commercial is annual. And this just gives the investor an idea to know if this is a good place to start. Obviously, they can find out all that information when they're actually interested in purchasing the property. But when they're using this, they're trying to decide if they're interested in seeing if they're interested in purchasing the property. So this gives them an idea. Again, a little bit more on investors in Unit 12. Unit 12 is our property management. And as property managers, the people that we work with, the owners, they're investors. That's what we're helping them with, is their income producing properties. So we'll talk more about the investor and the property manager when we get to Unit 12. So appraiser hat back on real quick, one more time. We're almost done with appraiser. Actually, no, we're gonna take a break. Watch your time, Julie. All right, so let's take a break. And we come back, we'll put our appraiser hat on one more time and wrap this unit up. All right, we're back. So I'm going to take attendance. And we're going to wrap this unit up. So appraiser's hat back on. The appraiser has arrived at value. They've looked at the sales comparison approach or the cost approach or the income capitalization approach. They're going to use as many as the three as they can. But if it's not a resale property or land, they can't use the sales comparison approach. If it's not an income producing property, they can't use the income capitalization approach. So they're going to use as many as they can. Thank you for telling me back. We have taken attendance. They're going to use as many as they can. And then they're going to sit down and work on their findings. And what they're going to do with their findings is a reconciliation. They're going to use all three approaches that they can. They're not going to use a weighted average. They're going to look at the approach that is the closest to the property that they're trying to put value on. Is this a resale? Is this a special use property? Or is this an income producing property? Reconciliation is not a simple averaging, but it's a way how they find their findings. Again, putting the most weight on the property they're trying to find that value on. So now that we know what we know, let's hold your place in the book and let's go back with our reading glasses to page 441. Now knowing what we know, we introduced you to our appraisal report yesterday, but now we have a better understanding of it. Again, the black line on the left-hand side shows you the different columns. So there's your categories. So there's your subject, contract, neighborhood, site, and improvements. That is spelled out for you on 440. Everything you see on 440 is what you see in the black line on the appraisal report. You guys see what I'm saying? So it explains what the different categories are on page 440. Over on page 442, this appraiser for this property was able to use a sales comparison approach. So they have their subject property, and then they have their comps with their adjustments. They also use the cost approach over on page 443. Right under the cost approach is the income capitalization approach. You'll notice that's blank. That tells us this is not an income producing property. They have nothing to fill in there if they don't know the income that it produces. So they've gone through, they've studied, they've done the reconciliation. And the very last thing is the reconciliation on 442. There's our indicated value by the sales comparison approach at 265, cost approach at 265,516. And based on their findings, they're going to put a value on this property of 265 as of August 25th, 2016. That's the number that the lender's caring about when they're looking for that loan to value ratio. Figure out which one they're going to originate the loan on, sales price or the appraisal. Questions? If you guys go back in your book, back to page 454, under the reconciliation, it talks about something called automated valuation method. You guys see that, or AVM? You guys know AVMs better as Zestimates. And Zestimates, what AVMs do, they do put a value on the property, but their approach isn't as precise as what the appraiser would use. So for example, you see the dot in the center of my circle there, that dot represents our subject property. And what the AVM does is it may say, for example, we're going to go out in a, let's pick a number, in a half a mile radius. Everything that closed within a half a mile from the subject property, we're going to use it to find the value. And that's all we're going to look at. Everything that closed in half a mile. We're not going to take into account number of bedrooms, square footage, type, age. Is there a garage? Is there a fireplace? Is there a pool? All we're going to look at is everything that closed within X amount of radius from the property. What do you think? Based on what we now know about sales comparison and adjusting comps and studying subject properties, do we think AVM's a reliable source for determining value? Not even a little bit. They just tell us what closed within that half a mile radius. But just about every website has them. So just be leery, because your buyers and sellers are seeing these and they're going to ask questions. We can show them the AVM and then we can show them our CMA and explain the differences to them. Appraiser hats back off, broker hats back on. Talking about our BPOs and CMAs one more time. As I mentioned last night, this is one of the few things that's covered under both license law and commission rule. License law 93A.6, that's one of the ones I have in the Campbell folder for you guys that I've asked you guys to read. And this talks about disciplinary action by the Real Estate Commission. And it does mention failure to properly complete or competently complete a CMA or a BPO could result in disciplinary action. It's also covered under Commission Rule 58A.2200. It's got its own section. It's got its own section. Again, you guys, I just have these here as references, but I do always find this interesting. A lot of things are covered under license law or Commission Rule. BPOs and CMAs are one of those things that's covered under both. So in the Real Estate Commission's weighing in, they say whenever we're doing a BPO or CMA, it must be in writing. Make sure you're only saying words such as probable sales price. And know that we can never perform a BPO or CMA for the purposes of determining market value to originate a loan. That is the appraiser's job. Just a quick recap. We saw this last night. You already have it. A non-provisional broker can do a BPO for a fee. We talked about a third party, maybe a relocation company. I had somebody in post licensing last year say that the broker that she was shadowing, the agent that she was shadowing, got a call from an attorney, a divorce attorney, to do a CMA to help him settle the divorce decree. And he was willing to pay her X amount just to offer her opinion so he could settle that divorce. We weren't trying to list the home. We weren't trying to get the business. We weren't doing it for our general brokerage selves. But the attorney was willing to pay. That's fine as long as you're not a provisional broker. Full broker and broker in charge can do one for a fee. And nobody can charge a fee when we're working with potential sellers or when we're working with buyers. When they say, oh, this is the dream house, how much should I offer? You cannot look at your buyer and say, well, you cut me a check and I'll tell you. That's just part of my job, general broker services. Questions? We leave this unit with one of my favorite, I think they call it a comic strip, but it's one of those ones that's funny because it's true. One of my favorite real estate comic strips relates to the appraiser. Appraisal. Just another simple reminder, isn't value in the eye of the beholder? What the property's worth absolutely is going to depend on who's looking at it. Remember, to the seller, this is their home. I've heard so many agents over the years saying the seller got emotional. Well, of course they did. This is their home. Home. To everybody else in the world, it's just a house. Tax assessor bit, that's what makes it funny but true, right? Because you know that's true. All right, that gets us through 17. There's key terms on page 433. There's key point review, your Cliff's notes, if you will, on page 457. Student quiz on 459. There is some practice, sales comparison approach, adjusting comps to match the subject. I believe there's some income capitalization approach as well. Both of these are also in that math workbook. So as you guys start going through that math workbook, it gives you another explanation with some extra practice there as well. Those math concepts, page 455 goes over the different approaches. And then these are the problems in the back of the book, those 50 problems in the back of the book. And these are the ones that relate to the math that we just did in unit 17. We good? Got these jotted down? Okay. Okay. I also have in the online learning system, we want to go out there real quick. The unit 17 material, there's some extra math practice in here. There's some extra problems to work, sales comparison approach, income capitalization. But I also have a sales comparison approach worksheet in here for you guys. And I think this is a good exercise for you guys for studying the subject and studying the comps and figuring out which comps would make the best comps for the appraiser to use. So here's your subject property is 231 Thomas Drive. Tells you it's a 1-story brick ranch with 3 beds, 2 baths, a 2-car garage, a deck, and it's 2,200 square feet. And then it gives you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different comps. Well, some of these are going to be better than others. My suggestion to you is do your columns and rows and do a comparison of subject and comps and see which comps would make the best comp. Not all of these are going to be great. For example, I'll give you one. Comp 2, we're not going to be able to use it because it hasn't closed yet. I don't know the closed price until it closes. We don't know the contract price. That's mainly designed that way to protect the seller. Think about it. If we went under contract and we advertised the contract price and then that contract fell through, Now, every buyer out there would know what that seller is willing to accept. So we see the list price, we see the closed price, but we don't see the numbers in between. So all we know is the list price, but we don't know the contract price for comp 2. So like I said, some of these are better than others. We do give you the values. So it tells you what a bedroom goes for, a bathroom, a garage, deck, etc. And then it says, using the above, find 3 good comps and determine the range for the probable sales price for the subject property. So again, I think this is a good exercise to have you guys going through and looking at the different comps and how they relate to the subject and seeing which one, which comps can be used. Remember, this is just everybody's opinion, right? Educated opinion. The solutions are my opinion. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. You may come up with a different opinion than me. This is what makes this so interesting. Appraisals and CMAs are everybody's take on it, if you will. But I did put my opinion in here, just so you can compare your opinion to my opinion. Obviously, for your test, you guys, they're not going to ask you to choose comps. They're going to say, here's your comps. So for your test, you got to adjust. But again, I think this is a good way to get you guys practicing that adjusting. Questions on Unit 17? Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, Julie, about how many questions in chapter 17 are we looking at for the exam?
I don't remember off
Do
the
you
top
know?
of my head. I don't remember. off the
Okay.
top of my head.
But it's
What is
not
it?
the. Mhm.
7, 8, 9, and 10 are your heavily tested units.
So-
Don't discount 17.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not at all. I'm just,
Okay.
all of this math is just.
Yeah,
woo.
yeah, no, and I get it. I still remember the math workbook breaks down. Remember page 1 of the math workbook, it tells you what math you can see at PSI and what math you can see on my exam. So it gives you that breakdown. And actually, never mind sales comparison approach, because it's not really math, right? You're just adjusting comps. So I guess you could interpret that as math. But yeah, sales
Just when I
comparison.
got a hang of 21, and then it's like now this. I'm like, oh God.
We move on, right? But remember too, you guys, your relink book, Real Estate Licensing in North Carolina, this is the booklet that we looked at that said, yay, I passed Julie's class, now what do I do? And remember, within this booklet, I think it's like page 17, yeah, it gives you the breakdown of how many questions you can expect to see on your state exam. So real property valuation, you're going to get 6 questions. I don't know exactly how many on my test, but I can tell you the weight is about the same. So I'm not standing here in front of you and saying there's 6 on mine, but the weight's about the same. So use this when you guys are getting ready for your state exam. It's a lot, I know. I get it. That leads me into my next point. What are we doing in 2 weeks from tonight? Do we know? Okay, good. We got a test in 2 weeks from tonight. Did y'all realize that? Was it brand new information? Breathe. Everybody breathe. I have a gift for you guys. I know it's 2 weeks away. And I know you guys were pretty much covering stuff up until the class before. But I know you guys need to start, and they're going to want to start studying for our exam. And the number one question I get is, what do we study for your exam, Julie? Well, remember, the syllabus tells you what you might see on your state exam. So what does my exam look like? At about 5 o'clock today, under, where is it? The Campbell folder, I put the finishing touches on an end of class exam review. You want to know what you can expect to see in 2 weeks? Ta-da! I suggest you go through it. I suggest you look through it. I suggest you use this to help you get ready for my exam. What I don't want you guys doing is calling me and saying, Julie, what are the classifications of agency relationships? If you don't know this and you call me, what do you think I'm going to tell you? Look it up. The truth is, I've already told you it didn't stick the first time. So how do you make it stick the second time? Look it up. So I know you guys are getting to this point. I know it's a lot. Use this as your guide to help prepare you for our end of class exam. It's called the end of class exam review. You are welcome. I've been where you are. Always remember that. I have been where you are. And if I can do it, then anybody can do it. Questions? All right. Next up, Unit 13. So we're going to hop around in the book again. We're going to go back to page 353. Unit 13 is our property insurance unit. This is one of these short and sweet units. We're going to see a lot of green stars. You may get a test question or two. Nothing like Unit 7. Nothing even like Unit 17. So we'll get through this unit pretty quickly. Y'all want to know the best way to get through property insurance basics? Put your insurance agent hat on. There's a separate school and a separate licensure, a separate test. They all got to do their thing too. We're just scratching the surface. We're just going to cover the basics. Interesting history about this unit. When the commission started the education department and they started this, they had insurance in, and at some point along the lines, they took it out. They said, real estate agents don't need to know property insurance. Probably 4 or 5 years ago, they added it back. And I will tell you why I think, in my honest opinion, they added it back when we get to it. But you guys understand, you're coming in to this industry with an advantage that a lot of agents didn't have. Y'all, when I took pre-licensing, we didn't have a property insurance unit. And now knowing what I know, I see the importance of adding it back. So again, my opinion, why I think it got added back, I'll share that with you when we get there. But we're just scratching the surfaces, covering some basics. So our roadmap, we're going to talk about the different types of homeowners insurance. We're going to talk about a few insurance issues. And let's start on page 352 with just defining some words. Insurance is the agreement between the insurer and the insured. Insurance is a bilateral contract. It's a two-way street. Parties have duties and obligations to each other. The insurer is the insurance company. The insured is the homeowner. Their relationship. I promise to give you money every year in exchange for protection if something happens to my property. That's our agreement. That's our bilateral contract. Insurer is the insurance company. The insured is the homeowner. If a buyer is using a loan, going through a lender to purchase a home, homeowner's insurance is required. Period. End of story. The lender will not approve the loan until they have reviewed the insurance policy. If it's a cash buyer, homeowner's insurance is highly recommended. So required if we're using a lender. The premium is the consumer's cost. What's the insured's cost of coverage? The insured's cost of coverage. Property insurance protects the insured from damages caused to the property. Property insurance also protects the insured to damages caused to their permitted improvements. Unpermitted space probably won't be covered under homeowners insurance. As we talked about, when we talk about unpermitted space, 5 or 6, I think. If I built this room, I added this room onto my house and I didn't have it permitted. And let's say that because I don't really know what I'm doing, there's faulty electrical behind this wall. When that faulty electrical catches on fire and burns the house down, and the fire marshal determines the source of the fire was faulty electrical behind this wall, the insurance company probably won't cover it because it was unpermitted. The insurance company will probably say, had you had it permitted, the electrical, the permit would have made sure that it was done right before they put the sheetrock up. Remember, we can count unpermitted space, but we have to disclose that it's unpermitted. And another reason why we have to disclose is because it probably won't be covered under homeowners insurance. Liability insurance protects the insured from losses or damages caused by or to third parties. So when your friends come over, they hurt themselves, they hurt you. Liability insurance will cover that. Package insurance just combines property and liability. Do I have any homeowners insurance agents on the call? Couple? Yeah, I usually get quite a few of those. Welcome. There are several different types of policies, starting on your book on 353. We're not going to go through all of them, just a few of them. First one we're going to go through is the HO3 policy. This is the most common. This is the one that we see the most often. This offers the minimum coverage that the lender requires. So in other words, you guys, when the buyer is out shopping for insurance, they just can't get any policy. The lender has to approve the policy before they'll approve the loan. So the HO3 covers that minimum coverage required by the lender, and it offers the insured the greatest amount of protection. Let's back up just for 1 second. You're a buyer's agent. You just got your buyer under contract. Mini celebration. You have the contract in your hand. The very first person after you send it to the buyer, the very next person you send that signed contract to is get it to the lender as soon as you possibly can so they can start their thing. The second person we send it to is the closing attorney so they can start their thing. Once we get the buyer communicating with the lender, we get that information, that first round of information for underwriting, while we are still in due diligence. That's when we need to tell our buyers to start shopping for homeowners insurance. Not all people and not all properties are easily insurable. So we want to make sure that your buyer can get their new home insured at a price that they can afford, that'll allow them to get loan approval while we're still in due diligence. Again, you guys, as a buyer's agent, worst case scenario, if we have to terminate, I want to do it within due diligence so I can get my buyer their earnest money back. So we want the lender to sign off on it. Make sure they're good. And another, always tell your buyers to shop around. Tell them to call Jake from State Farm. Tell them to call Flo from Progressive. Tell them to shop around. What's the little Geico's name? Does he have a name? I don't know. This could be a fun trivia question. We need to find that out. Don't look now, look after class. I would call that a distraction. So the HO3 is the most common because it offers the minimum coverage by the lender, provides the insured with the greatest amount of protection. It also mentions the HO4. This is also known as a renter's policy. We're going to talk about tenants in just a minute. It doesn't touch the real property, It only covers the renter stuff. It may cover the homeowner from any damage that the tenant has caused. I said may. So the HO4 is the renters. Another one that's kind of unique is the HO6 condo owners. This is called a walls in policy. Walls in. Remember, condo owners don't own exterior. They only own on the inside. But you guys can look at all these policies, 353, 354. Defining some more words on 354. A condition is a limitation on coverage. So an example of a condition might be vacant properties. We're going to talk about vacant properties in just a second. An endorsement is coverage for something that wouldn't normally be covered. Think of like something rare or valuable, some kind of antique. Something that normally wouldn't be covered, you could get an endorsement to cover that. An exclusion is an exclusion, you're excluding it from some kind of a loss due to some kind of specific event. For example, cover or loss due to acts of war or terrorism are very rarely covered in homeowners policies. They're excluded, they're an exclusion. So you got your buyer shopping around for homeowners insurance. And one thing that the homeowners insurance agent is going to look at when they're running your buyer through the process to figure out what their homeowners insurance is going to be for the first year, what is covered, how much they're going to pay, all that good stuff. The database that the insurance agent uses is called a CLUE report, Comprehensive Loss Underwriting Exchange. And they're going through, it's a claims history. So they're going through and looking at how many claims the person has made in the last 7 years. They're going to go through and look to see how many claims the property has had filed on it. Remember, I just said not all people are easily insurable, not all properties. And if you have a history of filing a claim, the insurance company, the CLUE report, may raise a flag. You can probably get coverage, but you're probably going to have to pay for it. Welcome back. Are you going to watch the recording to see what you missed? Okay. All right. You missed a good tip. So remember I said when we started this unit, I have an opinion on why this whole unit came back to pre-licensing. It's of my opinion, the reason we have the insurance unit back is to make sure that we understand and have a discussion with any vacant or unoccupied properties. Listing agents, at some point, your seller has to move out. Yes? Yep. When they move out and they leave that home vacant, vacant properties are much more susceptible to theft, damage, vandalism. If your seller's moving out the day or two before settlement, I probably wouldn't worry about it. But if your seller's moving out weeks or months before settlement, we need to encourage our seller to report that, to contact that to their insurance company. Because if they move out and the property's vacant and the insurance company, they try to file a claim because it was damaged or vandalized, insurance may not cover it because they vacated the property. So we need to have this conversation with our sellers if they're moving out ahead of time. It's an added risk. A vacant property is an added risk. Specifically with the vacant, they need to report that to the insurance agent. Will their premium go up for those weeks or months? Probably. But how much are they going to pay out of pocket for the damage or the vandalism if they don't report it? And it's of my opinion that this conversation listing agents are having with the sellers, it's of my opinion that this is the reason this whole unit came back. Making sure that we explain to our sellers the importance of reporting it to the insurance company so they can remain covered through the day of closing. Once again, I ask you, can I make anybody do anything? Unfortunately, no. So all I can do is have a conversation with my sellers, encourage them to report it, tell them the pros and cons. If this conversation's face-to-face or on the phone, am I going to go home and follow it up with an email? Yeah, because what do we document? Everything. So have that email. You go home and follow it up with an email talking about, per our discussion, I think you should report that you're moving out 2 months before closing to your insurance company. What they do with that information, I can't make them. All I can do is advise them. Unoccupied homes may not be as risky. Dealing with sellers, though, I mean, they're either living there or they're not, right? Especially as we get closer and closer to closing. Unoccupied homes, the stuff's still there. But usually what we deal with sellers is vacant once they're out. You may remember in Unit 10, we looked at our offer to purchase and contract. We have a risk of loss provision in our contract. There's a whole paragraph similar to what you see on 356, but it's been redone since the book's printed. So what you see in the contract isn't exactly like what you see in 356, but the idea is the same. The risk of the property being damaged or destroyed is on the seller through the day of closing. Please always remember, it's the seller's property until that deed changes hands. And so many times in my years, I've heard sellers say, yay, we're under contract. And my seller said, oh, good, I'm going to call my insurance company right away and cancel. Whoa, 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 whoa. It's still your property. If the house burns down when we are under contract, the risk is still on the seller. They are still the homeowner. So we need to make sure our sellers understand that they need to keep insurance on through the day of closing. If we really want to think this through, on the day of closing, the property is doubly insured, isn't it? The seller's policy is ending, the buyer's policy is beginning. So what if, I hear you, what if the house burns down on the day of closing? My gut tells me that it's going to come down to a timestamp. What time did it burn down and what time was that deed recorded? And I bet you both insurance agents are going to want to make sure what time that happened so they know which one's responsible for it. If the house is damaged, it burns down, struck by lightning, whatever, while we're under contract, the buyer can choose if they want to terminate or not. The buyer has choices, and that's what's spelled out in our contract as well. If the buyer chooses to terminate, house burns down, buyer terminates, they will get their earnest money and their due diligence back. If the buyer chooses not to terminate, we proceed to closing, And the buyer will get the seller's proceeds from their insurance company, from the seller's insurance company. If I were a buyer's agent and the house burned down when we were under contract and my buyer looked at me and said, what should I do? I would say, call your attorney. Because they need to make sure that they understand all of their options before they decide to terminate and take the earnest money due diligence or proceed, buy the home and take the seller's insurance. So let's bring this home to us real quick. We need to encourage our property owners, our sellers, talk to their insurance agency again. If they're going to leave, if they're going to vacate the property, they're going to leave it unoccupied for a period of time, or if they're going to move out, leave it totally vacant. You guys hear about this on the news every once in a while, right? Somebody breaks in and takes the copper wiring or something, you know? The insurance company can easily say, look, if you were living there, it may not have happened. Why didn't you tell us? We're not going to cover that. And then again, we need to have the conversation with the seller to maintain coverage until it closes, until that deed changes hands. Questions so far? Also, back in Unit 10, we talked about some times when possession may not happen at closing. So if we can agree, if the buyer and seller agree to do a buyer possession before closing, that means the buyer's moving in before the deeds changed hands, or the parties may do a seller possession after closing, which means the deed changes hands and the seller remains for a couple of days. If you're ever in a situation of either one of these, you need to tell whichever party you're working with, they need to call their insurance agent. Because in either one of those scenarios, somebody owns the property and somebody else is acting like the renter, the tenant. And both need to make sure that they're properly insured. Whomever owns it needs to have homeowner's insurance. Whomever's renting it needs to have renter's insurance. We do have forms for both of these situations. They are not a lease by any means. I mean, they're like a page and a half. They're just meant for short-term situations. Think like a couple of days, maybe a week. If you're going to do anything longer than that, probably want to get an attorney to draft up a lease on what the parties agreed to.
Miss Julie, I got a question for you.
Yeah.
Okay, so say that the buyer, well, the seller did stay a couple days after the buyer has already purchased the property.
Mhm.
So that would change the taxes and stuff, correct? Because isn't it still
Everything's
there?
changed for the buyers now. Yeah. So Tiffany, it's really funny to think about, right? Yesterday you owned this home. Today you're paying rent on the home that you owned yesterday. But yeah, all that's going to change to the buyer, and the both forms spell out who's responsible for taxes and utilities and landscaping and, you know, all that. How much is rent going to be? Again, this is just very like a couple days, very short term. I did a seller possession after closing. I represented the buyer, and the listing agent called me. Her sellers were building new construction. And one thing you need to know about new construction is delays happen. That's it. And so her seller's new construction got delayed just a few days. And the sellers had 3 kids, all under the age of 5. And they said, if we only have to move these kids one time, that would be great. Can we do a seller possession after closing? My buyers weren't moving in for a few months anyway. So I said, hey, what a great opportunity for you guys to make rent off the money that you just bought, like literally, you know? So it worked out. It was a beautiful transaction. Sellers were very appreciative of my buyers of letting them stay. My buyers weren't out anything. Like I said, they weren't planning on moving in right away anyway. So it really did work out. And I got to tell you guys, because my buyers were coming from Raleigh. So when the sellers moved out, I met the listing agent and got the key for them. So then I could get it to them, you know, when they came back up. Those sellers left that house in immaculate condition. They left a gift basket on the counter. They left gift cards. They left map of the area because they heard my guys were coming from Raleigh. So they left like local information. I mean, they left a very nice thank you because they were appreciative. I was lucky. I've heard some horror stories of these things on the street about them not going so smoothly, not going so well. Just make sure that you have discussion with whomever you're representing. There are risks, there are dangers, as with anything. If they have questions, they can call their attorney. But we need to get each party on the phone with their insurance agent. One's got to have homeowners insurance. The other one has to have renter's insurance. Questions? Another type of insurance we may encounter is flood insurance. If the property is located in a flood hazard, it may be subject to flood insurance. It depends on where the flood hazard is in relation to the property. So flood insurance is managed and regulated by FEMA. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA does more than require homeowners insurance. They try to reduce the impact of flooding. Areas that are prone to flooding over and over and over again, FEMA may get involved and try to help that, reduce that impact. FEMA determines the cost, the charges for flood insurance. So homeowners insurance, we're telling our buyers to shop around. We're telling them to shop, talk 2 or 3 different insurance agents. Those insurance agents will offer flood insurance, but they have no control over the pricing of it, how it works, the requirements, the regulations. That all runs down through FEMA. FEMA looks at several different factors when determining how much to charge for flood insurance. And those factors that FEMA looks at are on page 358. The bullet points at the top there. Year of the building, occupancy, number of floors, etc. And FEMA, there's like this algorithm that they plug all this information in, and it beep, boop, boop, and it spits a number out and says, this is how much you're going to pay based on this information. This is how much you're going to have to pay for flood insurance. So it's above and beyond homeowners insurance. So as far as homeowners insurance go, homeowners insurance agents aren't created equally. They're all different. They offer different rates. That's why we want our buyers to shop around. When it comes to flood insurance, this is what they got. I'm here to tell you guys right now, flood insurance is not cheap. If you know, you know. And if you have a buyer that is about maxed out, they're about to the tippy top of their loan approval, and you look at the map, which we'll talk about in a second, and you see on the map that the property may be in a flood insurance, you may want to encourage your buyer to go ahead and talk to an insurance agent before you get them under contract. Make sure that they can afford to pay that. So like we said, FEMA, they've defined the zones, the areas that are prone to flooding. And if the land is has any restrictions because of possible flood, if it's in a flood hazard, and FEMA designates it in a flood hazard, then the lender will require the flood insurance, the homeowner's insurance will require the flood insurance. So it's a separate policy above and beyond from homeowners insurance. So that map I just mentioned, FEMA's website, you can find this in several different places. My Winston-Salem people, let me help you get your bearings. If we were, this slide always makes me a little sad. If we were face to face right now, we would be here. So my Winston-Salem people, this is Stratford, this is Knollwood, Chick-fil-A is right there. Y'all know where I'm at now? Everybody knows where Chick-fil-A is. Probably got non-Winston people that know where this is. So Stratford, Knollwood, we would be here. This is 421, now known as Salem Parkway. And on the other side of 421 is a residential area. And what you have over here is a flood hazard. So if I were getting ready to write a buyer an offer and I pulled up the flood map and the property was, back in here somewhere, oops, I would encourage my buyer to talk to an insurance agent, especially if they were maxed out on their approved loan amount. If the lender says you're approved for 350 and we were looking at 345, they're awfully close to their allowable. The maps are designated, or the areas are designated as a 100-year floodplain. The 100-year floodplain, this name is so misleading. It's not helpful. This does not say it's going to flood once every 100 years. What the 100-year floodplain says is there's a 1% chance that it could flood each year. I don't know how they translate that to that, but the 100-year floodplain, there's a 1% chance. And guys, these flood zones change. If we have a period of time, a year with a whole bunch of rain, we're going to see areas flood now that have never flooded before. So they're going to redo these maps to show now they're in a 100-year big plain, because now there's a 1% chance that it could flood each year. So again, what we're just doing, we're just helping our buyers, raising flags. Like, look, I'm happy to write this offer, but you want to buy, this house right here, there's a really good chance you'd have to pay flood insurance. Are you good with that before we write up this offer? So we're doing research for our buyers, just like we're doing for our sellers, helping them gather the information on the property. When it comes to flood insurance, what's this mean for us? Anytime we see a property that's located that might be in a flood zone, well, first off, if we know of a property in flood zone, that's a material fact that we have to disclose. Listing agents, those are questions you need to ask the seller. You're going to want to look at the flood map yourself. If it's in a flood map, we need to disclose it's a material fact. But we also need to look out for possible signs of flooding. So for example, is it close to a body of water? Is there a creek, a river, a stream, a lake? We know what a good, hard, fast spring rain will do, right? Creeks turn to streams, streams turn to rivers, rivers turn to these gushing, angry bodies of water. So we can have flags go up. We're looking for possible signs. Where's proximity to water to the property? Also, for us, we need to be aware we're having these discussions, just any insurance, not just flood insurance, just insurance in general. Telling your seller, keep coverage until it closes. Get your buyer to get their policy while we're still in due diligence. The lender has to approve it. The lender has to verify that they can afford it. And the lender has to make sure the policy is adequate for their requirements. Short, sweet, and to the point. Do we like this unit? Got those key terms back on page 351. Key point review. 359. And then our student quiz. On page 361. I think you should look over unit 13. I do not think you should spend all your study time on unit 13. Expect to see 1 or 2 questions. Look it over and get those 1 or 2 questions. Every little point helps, right? Every little point counts. Basic understanding. This is a unit. We have that basic understanding so we can point our buyers and sellers in the right direction. Questions on insurance? Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we get into unit 11. Unit 11. we're back. So I'm going to take attendance. I'm going to jump into Unit 11. Unit 11, we're going to switch gears just a bit. The bulk of this class revolves around the residential sales transaction. However, there is just a little bit on landlord and tenant and property management. So we're going to get started in Unit 11 tonight. When we come back together on, I guess next week, is today still Thursday? When we come back together next week, we'll finish 11, we'll do Unit 12. Unit 11 is about the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. Maybe there's a real estate agent involved, maybe there's not. But there are certain rules that the landlord and tenant applies to. Unit 12 is when we bring the agent into the picture. So right now in 11, we're just going to focus on the landlord-tenant relationship. Our map, we're going to talk about leasehold estates, explain what that is and talk about it. We're going to identify some basic characteristics of a lease, some things that we can typically see in a common lease. We have a couple of different types of leases, so we're going to talk about those types and what their purposes are. And then we're going to look at the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. So starting on page 310, let's just define some words. The lease is the contract, the bilateral contract between the lessor and the lessee. The lessor is the giver of the lease or the landlord. The lessee is the receivee of the lease or the tenant. So it's a bilateral agreement, which means both parties have to perform. And the gist of a lease says, I will let you live in a property that I own in exchange for rent. There are some requirements under both, for both landlord and tenant, under the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. If we get there tonight, we won't get far into it. So we may get to look at the Residential Rental Agreement Act Tuesday night. The lease, as I just said, is a bilateral agreement. Basic contract law that we looked at in Unit 9 is going to apply to a lease. So that basic contract applies to our sales contracts, also to our leases. You guys remember, let's go back in time, way back to Unit 2. And we talked about an estate. We defined estates. Let's have some fun. Who can remind me, in one word, when you hear the word estate, what's one word we can use to describe an estate? And in one word, look at you guys go. In one word, an estate is an interest. Yep, it's an interest. So when we're talking about a couple different types of estates, we're talking about what type of interest does the owner have in the property. Freehold estates we looked at back in Unit 2. Freehold estates were our estates, our ownership. What's your interest? You own the property. Now we're going to talk about leasehold estate, also known as non-freehold. Leasehold estates can also be known as non-freehold estates. And thank you guys for telling me that. The interest in a leasehold estate is one of possession. You do not own it, but you have the right to be there. And that's what the tenant-landlord relationship is about. That's what the leasehold estate is about. We got a couple different types of leasehold estates, which of course we're going to talk about. We're going to break each of these down. Before we do that, I do need to go off book just for one slide, just to get some other terms in there. And the big thing we need to understand from this slide is that leases have both types of interest. Both types of estates are involved because somebody owns it, somebody has a freehold estate, and somebody else lives there. Somebody has the leasehold, somebody has the freehold. So these kind of combine both types. Again, that's the big takeaway from this slide. We deal with two different types of estates. There's an estate of ownership and an estate of possession. So we're going to talk about the different types of estates. They're summed up for you guys, leasehold estates. They're summed up for you guys nicely at the top of page 311. I like the chart. I like the figure. Sums it up for us. And the first type of the leasehold estate that we have is an estate for years. This can also be known as a tenancy for years. Let me say this, as we're talking about the different types of estates, the thing that makes them different, the thing that defines them is how they end. So let's be paying attention to how each type of leasehold estate ends. And in an estate for year, we have a specific beginning date and we have a specific ending date. And when it's over, it's over. We don't have to give each other notice. We've already agreed to the date that it's going to end. So it automatically ends on that time. This is very important that you guys hear me. When we talk about an estate for years, do not let the name fool you. An estate for years can be for a couple years. It can be for a few months. It could be for a few weeks. It could be for a day. What makes it an estate for years? Because it has a definite period of time. We know the starting date, we know the ending date. It has nothing to do with how long that period of time is. So an estate for years can be any period of time, does not have to be multiple years. When it's over, it's over. Could we agree to extend our estate for years? Sure. But we don't have to because we're only contractually obligated to each other from this date to that date. Another type of leasehold estate is a periodic tenancy, also known as a tenancy from period to period. This one has a specific start date, but it doesn't have a specific end date. One of the parties has to end it. We're going to keep renewing it month after month or year after year, whatever we decide. And we're going to keep renewing it until somebody gives notice. Somebody has to end it. Now in North Carolina, there is minimum notice requirement. I'm on page 311. The bullet points near the bottom. If it's a week-to-week lease, we have to give each other 2 days notice. Month to month, we have to give each other 7 days. If it's a year to year, we have to give each other 1 month notice. So how much notice we give each other is dictated. But we keep going and going and going until somebody ends it. It's not uncommon for an estate for years to turn into a periodic tenancy. If you sign a year lease with me, and after that year we decide we're good, I like you because you're paying me rent on time. You like me because I'm not hassling every other day. We have a good relationship. We can decide when our estate for years is over to continue doing a periodic tenancy. Keep going on the terms. The only thing that's changed is now we don't have a specific ending date. One of us has to end it. Another leasehold estate is an estate at will, also known as a tenancy at will. This one exists because the landlord gave you permission to be there. You're there because the landlord said it was okay. We don't have an ending date. The difference in an estate at will and a periodic tenancy, no notice is required. An estate at will can end at any time without any notice. The last leasehold estate that we have is an estate at sufferance, also known as a tenancy at sufferance. With these types of estates, somebody is suffering. You know who's suffering? The landlord, because they got a tenant that they can't get rid of. They got a squatter, they got a holdover. That tenant was probably there under a legit lease. That lease ran up and they didn't leave. And now the landlord's got a squatter on their hands. They got somebody that they got to get out. How do they get out? We'll talk about that when we get to the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. There are laws in place that the landlord has to follow. And let me rephrase that. There are laws in place that the landlord should follow when dealing with a squatter or a holdover. So we'll see this again. The lease ends. They might have been there for an estate for years. After that year, this is what I need everybody to understand. And why don't you guys go ahead and write this down? If you pay, you stay. If you stay, you pay. As long as the tenant is paying and the landlord is accepting the rent, we have a periodic tenancy or an estate at will. This is an estate at sufferance because this person is here and not paying. So the easiest way I can help you guys understand this landlord-tenant relationship, if you pay, you stay. If you stay, you pay. If money stops changing hands, that's when the problems come out. You cannot have a landlord tell you they have a squatter and they're collecting rent every month. Questions on the different types of leasehold estates? So now that we know the different types of estates, let's talk about the different types of leases. This conversation in general tends to be a problem topic. Again, we're going to see a lot of yellow stars, so we need a pretty basic understanding. There's a nice chart for you guys on page 313. We're going to talk about each of those. But the determining factor of what type of lease it is how rent gets paid. There's several different methods that rent could get paid. So what kind of lease it is determined by how rent gets paid. And the first type of lease we have is a fixed rental. This is what we typically see in residential. The tenant pays X amount to the landlord. The tenant does not directly pay the property charges. So for example, do I have any renters on the call? I've asked about all my homeowners. Now, there we go. There are my renters. Yep. So when you guys pay your rent every month, and I'm assuming when you pay your rent every month, you just cut one check or Cash App, whatever you do to your landlord, right? And you just send them money every month. Do you pay the property taxes? Do you pay the insurance? Well, I mean, technically you do, but do you pay them directly? I guess I should ask. You pay the landlord pays the bills. The landlord pays the property taxes. I could just about promise you the cost for those are rolled into your rent. But you don't pay them directly. You pay the landlord pays taxes, insurance, the mortgage if they have one, etc. All of these other types of leases that we're getting ready to talk about are mostly for commercial leases, mostly what we see in commercial transactions. So the only residential one we're going to talk about is a fixed rental. So in the commercial world, the types of leases we're dealing with, there's something called a percentage lease. The only reason this has a red star is because this, again, it's one of those things that I hesitate to call it math, but we are going to have to pick up a calculator. Percentage leases are common in like malls, for example. And in the mall, the tenant pays a base rent. They pay X amount every month. Usually that base rent is determined on square footage. How much space are they occupying? So like Belk is going to pay a higher base rent than Claire's, right? Because they occupy more space. They take up more space. So the base rent is a flat fee every month. In addition to the base rent, the tenant's going to pay a percentage of their gross or net income. Which one needs to be spelled out in the lease? You know, the mall, because you know, the mall usually has like a, y'all remember when malls are fun? All right, so back when malls were fun, the malls usually have like this common area, like, you know, the food court, the halls, they got janitorial, maintenance staff, you know, that kind of thing. But malls also have, you know, they do things to chip in money to try to bring things into the mall to get consumers to come. For example, there are two very special guests that are usually invited to the mall each year. And I don't want to say too much in case there are little ears around. But we get to meet the Easter Bunny and we get to meet Santa Claus twice a year, right? All those stores, all that rent is going towards those special guests because parents take kids to meet Santa. Parents come with a pocketbook. After we meet Santa, what do we want them to do? Go shopping, spend money. So they kind of work together. All of them work together. And that's part of what this percentage, if we can get the people in, we can probably get them spending money. And they do lots. I mean, they used to do. So we're going to look again, not getting excited about this math. I doubt you're going to see a math problem on this, but we're just going to look at a math problem together. Put your pencils down if you want to. We're just going to look at a math problem together just to get an idea of what this kind of math would look like. So based on the tenant square footage, the mall charges a base rent of $1,300 per month. In addition, the terms of the lease state the tenant will pay 5% of gross sales on any amount over $160,000. Last year's sales were $250,000. What is the tenant's total annual rent? So if we look at the base rent first, we're told that it's $1,300 per month. The problem wants me to speak in terms of annual. So if we're paying $1,300 per month, we're going to take that times 12, and that's going to give us our annual base rent of $15,600. You owe this money no matter what you make this year, no matter what your sales are. You owe for your space in the mall, you owe $15,600. That's your base. In addition, the terms of the lease state that the tenant pays 5% on any gross sales over $160,000. So last year, we looked at your books and we saw you had sales of 250,000. And the terms state that you pay on anything over 160. So what you owe that percentage on is the difference, or $90,000. Anything over 160, you have that 5% percentage. So now that we know that difference, take 5%. And then we just take our base rent plus our percentage. And your rent for the year for this space in the mall is going to be $20,100. So you take the base rent plus your percentage. Could the percentage change next year? I mean, this year your sales were 250. Are they going to be 250 this year, next year? We don't really know yet, do we? So we have to, part of the agreement is you pretty much got to turn your books over, show your proof so they know how much to charge you for that percentage. Questions on percentage lease? Again, the idea of it more than the calculations. Somebody says, no wonder some stores have crazy prices, right? Amazon doesn't charge us for all this. Another lease we may see in commercial leases, or another lease is called a net lease. Again, for commercial properties. In a net lease, the tenant pays the rent, plus they're also going to pay property taxes and insurance and maintenance, landscaping. So not only are they paying the landlord the rent, they're also paying some or all of the property charges. Another lease we might see in commercial is the graduated lease. This is a long-term, a multiple year lease, maybe 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. And rent is going to go up at a predetermined date. Rent is going to increase, it's going to graduate. So you're going to start low. Maybe next year your rent goes up a little bit. 3 years from now, it goes up a little bit. We've already decided when it's going up and how much. For a graduated lease, think of a startup business. You just started a new company, you got a lease, maybe you took a 5-year lease or a 3-year lease. You're not making any money yet, you just started. But each year your rent's going to go up with the expectation that your business is growing. Another type of commercial lease is called an index lease. Again, multiple years. And these rent is going to increase or decrease. And it's going to increase or decrease based on some agreed upon index. So for example, we could allow increases and decreases based on the government's cost of living index. When the government's cost of living index goes up, your rent goes up. When the government's cost of living index goes down, your rent goes down. Multiple years. Rent adjusts throughout the term based on some agreed upon index. Another type of lease you may see in the commercial world is called a ground lease. In a ground lease, the tenant only pays rent on the land. They build the building. They rent out the land, they build on it. These are really, really long-term leases. In some cases, think like 99 years. To my understanding, this is how Walmart operates. Say what you want to about Walmart, but they are brilliant. Think about it. They own a chunk of land somewhere. You want to franchise a Walmart, you got to pay rent on that land. In addition, you got to build the Walmart. The cost of building the Walmart is on you. So you're paying them rent on the land every month. It's your building. And they're collecting part of your proceeds because they are Walmart. It's genius. Another good example of this might be a hunk of land. I wish I had a chunk of land that Verizon wanted to put a tower on. They would rent land from me, build their tower, be responsible for maintaining the tower. All I have to do is walk out to my mailbox every month and collect my rent money. They're renting the land and then they're building on it to conduct their business. Where was this in business school at UNCG? I mean, seriously, why didn't we talk about this? Let's see, request to go back for 1 second. Good. So ground leases, again, you guys, these are like long-term leases. Like, I mean, seriously, would you build a Walmart if you had a 3-year lease? No, because we know that building's going to last a lot longer, right? So think like 99 years, for example. Another commercial lease is a full service lease. For these, think about office parks. It's a multi-tenant building, but they all share common expenses. Part of your rent goes towards common expenses. So for example, we might have one janitorial crew, one maintenance crew. They're responsible for maintaining the building, but part of your rent goes towards those expenses. Maybe utilities. Maybe the utilities, the power, water is rolled into that full service lease. You pay the rent, they provide the service. Questions on the different types of leases? Over on page 315, we talk about the essential elements of a valid lease. Of course, anytime we talk about essential elements, we're saying, how is the judge going to interpret this lease? I hope this list looks pretty familiar to you. This takes us back to Unit 9, Basic Contract Law. What are the essential elements of a contract? Well, we need mutual agreement, meeting of the minds. Landlord and tenant have to come together and agree on the terms. How much rent for how long? Some form of consideration, no free promises. In terms of a lease, the consideration is rent, possibly the security deposit that we are talking about. Capacity to contract, parties have to be of sound, sober mind. And basic contract law says you cannot have a legally binding contract for an illegal purpose. So the objective of the contract Then starting on page 315, we talk about some other provisions that are pretty common to find in a lease. Not required, not necessary, just not uncommon to see. So some other common provisions found in the lease. The tenant's use of the space, particularly in a commercial lease. If it's a lease for an office park, the tenant probably won't be able to open up a bar, right? So it's got to be an office space in the office park. So if there's a particular use that the tenant has to have, that needs to be spelled out. Again, on commercial leases, I mean residential too, but specifically commercial, especially industrial leases, maybe warehouse leases, we got to make sure we're all in compliance with environmental concerns. Every once in a while, you hear about a restaurant that dumps their grease in the creek out back. Yeah, they can't do that. It's an environmental concern. If there is an environmental concern, an environmental issue, they're contacting the landlord. They have no idea about the tenant. So the landlord's going to be liable. The landlord's going to be the one that's responsible, the owner. Fixtures may be a provision in a lease, particularly commercial leases, specifically trade fixtures. Remember trade fixtures back in Unit 2? Trade fixtures are the commercial tenants' fixtures they can put in the home to allow them to conduct their trade, to conduct their business. At the end of the lease, the commercial tenant can take their trade fixtures with them. Repairing any damage they cause to the property, of course. Provisions about repairs are going to depend if it's a residential or commercial. For commercial or non-residential, usually the landlord is not required to make repairs for commercial. When we get to the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act, we're going to see that that's the landlord's biggest responsibility, is providing those fit and habitable conditions. So it differs from residential or commercial, but generally in commercial, the landlord is not going to provide repairs. However, in commercial, what they may offer is an upfitting improvement. Usually commercial space starts at the studs. And the tenant can come in and upfit. They can create the space to make it fit their needs. Put in the walls, however they need it to look. It is not uncommon for the landlord to provide X amount for upfitting costs to get it ready for the tenant. If the tenant goes over that amount, then that'll be the responsibility of them. But upfitting improvements are not uncommon. There may be a provision in the lease about whether or not it can be assigned. Remember, an assignment, all the terms stay the same. The only thing that changes is the names of one of the parties. There may also be a provision that allows for a sublease. The original leasee has some liability. They don't transfer all of their interest. They still do keep some liability. So if the new tenant stops paying, the landlord could go after both parties. Still uncommon major provisions, the term of the lease, how long? Is it a state for years? Is it a period to period? state for years, specify how long. And then if we're going to allow for an automatic renewal or not, those terms and renewals should be spelled out. Most contracts, specifically leases, have some kind of default provision that discusses what happens if either party breaks their promise, if either party breaches. So what legal remedies are provided for is very common to see in a lease. We talked about option to purchase and first right of refusal back in Unit 10. These may be option, they may be considered in the lease. If the tenant, if the tenant wants to buy the property, then we can put those provisions in the lease. And then another common provision in a lease is the landlord's right to enter. Let's go back to residential specifically. If there's no mention about the landlord's right to enter in the lease, what do you think the landlord's right to enter is? Emergencies only. So if the landlord wants the right to enter, we got to add a provision. And usually you're going to see the landlord pending emergencies. Landlord has to give a 24-hour notice or a 48-hour notice. The landlord just can't show up unannounced, unexpected. Remember our legal bundle of rights? When you let somebody live in your property, when you let somebody have a lease and live in your property, you're unbundling your rights and you're giving some of those rights to the tenant. And that tenant, due to the law, has the right of quiet enjoyment, which means the tenant has the right to live in that home without interference from anyone, including the landlord. So if the landlord wants the right to enter, they have to put something in and again discuss how much notice is required. I'm not going to lie, when we rented out my little condo a couple years ago, that was the hardest thing for me. Like the first 2 days, and then I got over it pretty quickly. But like day one, I gave the key, tell me I can't, it's my condo. If I want to go in my condo, I'll go in my condo. And like by day 3, I was fine. I'm like, yeah, whatever. But the first couple of days, I was like, dang, I can no longer just show up and walk in the front door of a property that I own. Isn't that something? Those are your unbundling your rights. You're giving your rights over to that person that you're letting have that leasehold estate, that estate of possession. Totally over it now, by the way. I'm good. I forget about it sometimes until I get rent. I'm like, oh yeah, I got a great tenant. Questions on some common provisions you may find in leases? There is a real fear of damage to the property. That's why we have things like security deposits. We'll talk about that Tuesday. That's another big concern I had about becoming a landlord, because you hear these horror stories about tenants moving out in the middle of the night, taking the kitchen cabinets with them as they go, ripping them off the wall. So far, so good. My husband has this theory that because he was a good tenant, we're going to get a good tenant. That karma theory. Common provisions. Not to confuse those with the essential elements. Keep those separate. Essential elements are required. The common provisions are the ice cream and the icing and the sprinkles on the cake. Most leases have to eventually end. So how we end a lease, mutual agreement, Parties agree to get into a lease, the parties can agree to get out. If the lease expires, if it's in a state for years, and the lease expires, it's going to end the lease, operation of law. If the landlord loses the property in foreclosure or bankruptcy, that will terminate the lease. There are laws in place to protect the tenant in the event of foreclosure. Now, prior to the housing market crash, there were not. If the landlord's going into foreclosure, going to lose the property, the foreclosure, do you think they're communicating that with their tenant? Probably not. And prior to the housing market crash, tenants were coming home from work and seeing an eviction notice on their front door. There's laws in place now to protect the tenant. We'll see those briefly later in this unit. And then if either party fails to do their obligation. So the basis, the gist of the landlord-tenant relationship, residential. The tenant provides rent in exchange for fit habitable conditions. The landlord's number one responsibility is to provide fit and habitable conditions. And what do they get for that? They get rent. So if the landlord fails to provide fit and habitable conditions, the tenant can't be forced to stay. We'll talk about that when we get to the residential. But remember, if they stay, they pay. But there is an opportunity for a tenant to essentially evict themselves if the landlord's not upholding their end of the deal and providing those fit and habitable conditions. And that's all covered under the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. Some old familiar friends weigh in on leases. Statute of frauds says it's got to be signed and in writing. Connor Act says it has to be recorded. You guys have those on flashcards yet? Connor says it's got to be recorded. Statute of frauds says it has to be signed in writing. And both of them weigh in on leases. Both of them run parallel with this. And what they both say is that leases for more than 3 years need to be in writing, signed, and recorded. In other words, you could have a valid lease for a year that's not in writing, that's not recorded. Is it just good sense to put everything in writing? If you're going to rent my house for a day, wouldn't it be just good sense to put it in writing? Sure. Test is not going to ask you what you're going to do. The test is going to ask you what the statute of fraud says about it. The test is going to ask you what the Connor Act says about it. Don't get in your own way. And please note that says more than 3 years. 3 years does not have to be in writing and recorded. 3 years and 1 day does. Questions? This is a good place to stop. Don't go anywhere just yet. Everybody good on the slides? Wait, here? Down at the courthouse, public records. Yep. Yep. Is that what you're asking? Yep. Yep, everything recorded is down at the Register of Deeds, down at the courthouse. Okay, so let's talk about what next week's gonna look like. We're gonna finish Unit 11, you see on page 319. We'll start on Tuesday talking about the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. We'll get into the security deposit. Once we're done with 11, we'll get into Unit 12. Unit 12 brings the agent into the lease relationship. So remember 11, maybe an agent's involved, maybe they're not. 12, now the agent's getting involved. So we're gonna look at property management, in unit 12. After unit 12, we go to unit 19. Unit 19 is our fair housing unit. I'd really like you guys to look ahead at the fair housing unit. Fair housing is not only important for your test, it's important for your real estate career. I do not know of something that can get you in trouble faster than a fair housing violation. So it's one of those things to have you guys start looking at. We'll have that conversation. So I say finish 11, we'll do 12, 19. After that, we do 18 and 16. 18 and 16 won't take us but an hour and a half to get through one of those, two of those short and sweet units. We may get started on license law and commission rule next week too. If you haven't looked at the comments, I gotta ask, has anybody looked at those comments yet? Good, good, kinda good. I'll take it. The comments, and let me just refresh you. The comments are a big chunk, whoops, big chunk of our license law and commission rule. So we're in the online learning system, license law and commission rule, and there's the comments. And this is a big chunk of our state section. Guys, students struggle most in the state specific sections, and I'll tell you why. Think of the national as like the big overall. The state is zoomed in, and it's very, very particular. It is law and rules. It's very precise, very particular. So please read the comments. Most of what we talk about when we start this, probably get started on this next Thursday. And most of what we talk about is going to come from here. There are some other law and rules that we need to discuss. We'll pick those up as we go. But I think once you start looking through these comments, and I think what you guys are going to learn when we start going through them, is that by doing this section last, this is a great review. You're going to see things like agency disclosure, agency agreements. We're going to talk about BPOs and CMAs. We're going to talk about the trust account, the comments. So some things new, but some things are going to be a great review. So looking this over can serve you twofold. Again, license law and commission rule, and just focus on the comments. So that's where we are for next week. Questions? All right. Y'all have a great weekend. We'll see you guys Tuesday night. Thank you.
I have a question on 14.
Yeah.
Okay.